The autumn air in Atherton, California, carried the crisp scent of eucalyptus trees as parents streamed into the gymnasium of Sacred Heart Preparatory School. The familiar squeak of sneakers on polished floors mixed with the excited chatter of families gathering for the annual fourth-grade production of The American Dream. Stephen Curry adjusted his Warriors cap and checked his phone one more time before sliding it into his pocket. Beside him, Aisha smoothed her jacket and scanned the crowd, her photographer's eye already framing the moment. They'd arrived 30 minutes early, as they always did for Cannon's school events, despite Stephen's packed schedule during the early season. "Dad, do you think he's nervous?" Riley whispered, leaning against her father's arm. At 13, she'd grown protective of her younger brother, remembering her own stage fright from elementary school performances. Stephen's warm brown eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "He's been practicing his lines for weeks, sweetheart. Remember how he kept reciting them at dinner?" The gymnasium buzzed with the energy of a community coming together. Parents clutched programs, grandparents adjusted their glasses, and younger siblings fidgeted in their seats. The makeshift stage, constructed from plywood and draped with red, white, and blue bunting, stood proudly at one end of the room. Hand-painted backdrops depicting Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty provided the setting for tonight's performance. Cannon had landed the role of Thomas, a young immigrant arriving in America with his family in the early 1900s. For 3 weeks, he'd thrown himself into the part with the same intensity he brought to basketball practice. Every evening after homework, he'd stand in the living room gesturing dramatically as he delivered Thomas's pivotal monologue about hope and perseverance. "The land of opportunity awaits," he'd proclaimed to his family's applause, his 8-year-old voice carrying conviction that made Stephen's chest swell with pride. Mrs. Patterson, the fourth-grade teacher and director, had pulled Stephen aside after a recent parent-teacher conference. "Cannon has such natural stage presence," she'd said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "He really understands the emotional weight of his character's journey. You should be very proud." As the lights began to dim, Aisha reached over and squeezed Stephen's hand. "He's going to be amazing," she whispered. The curtain rose, to reveal 22 fourth-graders in period costumes, their faces painted with excitement and nervous energy. The opening scene unfolded smoothly, with children portraying families saying goodbye to their homelands, carrying cardboard suitcases and cloth bundles. Stephen leaned forward slightly, his athlete's focus now entirely on the small figure of his son, standing stage left in suspenders and a newsboy cap. Cannon's costume had been Aisha's project, and she'd spent hours perfecting the details, from the worn patches on the knees to the carefully frayed edges of his shirt. The first act progressed beautifully. Students delivered their lines with the earnest conviction that only children possess, and the audience responded with warm laughter at the scripted moments of levity. Stephen found himself thinking about his own childhood, remembering the school plays he'd participated in during his elementary years in Charlotte. His father, Dell, had never missed a performance, no matter how demanding his NBA schedule had been. Now, watching Cannon navigate the stage with growing confidence, Stephen felt that familiar surge of paternal pride mixed with something deeper. The recognition of his son's individuality, his willingness to try new things, to put himself out there despite the risk of failure. The second act began with Thomas's family arriving at Ellis Island. Cannon stepped forward for his first significant speaking role, his young voice clear and strong as he described the journey across the ocean. The audience was captivated, leaning in to catch every word. But as the scene progressed toward Thomas's crucial monologue, the moment Cannon had practiced countless times at home, something shifted. Stephen noticed it first, a slight hesitation in his son's posture, a flicker of uncertainty that crossed his features like a shadow. The setup line came from his stage partner Sarah, playing Thomas's older sister. "But Thomas, what if America isn't what we hoped it would be?" Cannon opened his mouth to respond with the rehearsed words about dreams and determination, about the courage it takes to start over in a new place. Instead, silence filled the gymnasium. Seconds stretched into eternity. Stephen felt his heart rate quicken as he watched his son's eyes widen with panic. Cannon looked out at the audience, his young face flushed with embarrassment, his mouth moving soundlessly as he searched for words that seemed to have vanished completely. The other children on stage began to fidget, sensing something was wrong. Mrs. Patterson, visible in the wings, gestured encouragingly, but Cannon seemed frozen in place, overwhelmed by the sudden blank in his memory and the weight of 200 pairs of eyes watching him. Stephen felt Aisha's grip tighten on his hand. In the row behind them, he could hear whispered comments from other parents, a mixture of sympathy and second-hand embarrassment. But all Stephen could see was his son, vulnerable and struggling, needing help in a way that basketball victories and championship rings couldn't provide. This was the moment every parent dreads and every child fears. That instant when preparation meets panic, when all the practice in the world can't overcome the simple, human reality of stage fright. Time seemed suspended in that gymnasium, each second stretching like taffy as Cannon stood frozen center stage. Stephen could see his son's chest rising and falling rapidly, the telltale sign of panic that he recognized from his own high-pressure moments on the basketball court. But this wasn't about three-pointers or championships. This was about an 8-year-old boy facing his fears in front of everyone who mattered to him. The silence in the room was deafening. Other parents shifted uncomfortably in their folding chairs, some pulling out their phones to check the time, others exchanging sympathetic glances. A few younger siblings began to whisper, sensing the tension, even if they couldn't understand its source. Stephen felt every muscle in his body tense, his protective instincts kicking into overdrive. This was his child up there, vulnerable and struggling, and every fiber of his being wanted to leap onto that stage and somehow make it better. He'd faced down playoff crowds in hostile arenas, had performed under pressure that could make or break championships, but none of that compared to watching his son's distress. Aisha leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "Should we give him a moment?" Stephen whispered back, though his heart was racing. He knew Cannon was strong, had seen him bounce back from missed shots in youth basketball, from difficult math tests, from the everyday disappointments that shape a child's resilience. But this felt different, more exposed, more public. On stage, Cannon's scene partner Sarah showed remarkable composure for a 9-year-old. Instead of standing awkwardly waiting for his response, she gently repeated her line, giving him another chance. "Thomas, what if America isn't what we hoped it would be?" Cannon blinked, his eyes scanning the audience until they found his father's face in the crowd. In that brief connection, Stephen saw something that broke his heart. Not just fear, but the particular kind of disappointment that comes when you've let yourself down, when you've practiced something 100 times and still can't make it work when it matters most. That's when Stephen made his decision. He'd spent his entire professional career understanding the power of support, of believing in someone when they couldn't believe in themselves. Every great play he'd ever made had been built on the foundation of teammates who had his back, coaches who trusted him even when he missed, fans who cheered even when he struggled. Now it was his turn to be that support for the person who mattered most. Without overthinking it, Stephen rose from his seat. The movement was subtle at first, just a father standing to get a better view of his son's performance. But then he took a small step into the aisle, his presence becoming more noticeable. "You've got this, Cannon," he called out softly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the stage without overwhelming the moment. His tone was warm, encouraging, the same voice that had helped Cannon through countless bedtime fears and playground disappointments. The audience began to turn, noticing the NBA superstar in their midst, but Stephen's attention remained laser-focused on his son. He raised his hands slightly, not in a dramatic gesture, but in the quiet, confident way he might signal a play to a teammate. His expression radiated belief, not just hope, but absolute certainty that Cannon could overcome this moment. Cannon's shoulders straightened slightly. The connection with his father seemed to anchor him, reminding him that this stage, this moment, this forgotten line, none of it defined him. He was more than his mistakes, bigger than his fears. "It's okay to be scared," Stephen continued, his voice gaining slight volume but maintaining its gentle tone. That's what makes you brave. The words weren't part of the script, but they felt more authentic than any rehearsed dialogue. Around the gymnasium, parents began to smile, recognizing the universal truth in the moment. Every adult in that room had faced their own version of Cannon's frozen stage. Job interviews, first dates, presentations, moments when preparation met panic and came up short. Mrs. Patterson, still positioned in the wings, nodded approvingly. This wasn't how she'd planned the performance, but she recognized something more valuable than perfect execution. A teachable moment about resilience, about family support, about the courage it takes to continue when things don't go according to plan. Cannon took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving his father's face. Stephen could see the wheels turning in his son's mind, not searching for the exact scripted words, but finding something more authentic, more real. The other children on stage began to relax as well, sensing that this unexpected turn wasn't a disaster, but an opportunity. Sarah stepped slightly closer to Cannon, offering her own subtle support, while the other young actors waited patiently, their earlier nervousness replaced by curiosity about how this scene would unfold. In the audience, Riley had grabbed her mother's hand, her teenage cynicism temporarily replaced by genuine concern for her. "Little brother, he's going to be okay, right?" she whispered. Aisha nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears, not of sadness, but of pride in both her son's vulnerability and her husband's response to it. This was why she'd fallen in love with Stephen, not for his athletic achievements or public success, but for moments like this, when his character revealed itself in quiet acts of love and support. The gymnasium held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Cannon stood, taller now, his panic beginning to transform into something else. Determination, courage, the particular kind of strength that comes from knowing you're not alone. Cannon looked out at his father's encouraging face and felt something shift inside him. The scripted words that had vanished from his memory didn't seem as important anymore. Instead, standing there in his immigrant costume with 200 people waiting for him to speak, he found something more authentic than any rehearsed monologue. "Sometimes," Cannon began, his voice small but growing stronger, "sometimes you forget what you're supposed to say." It wasn't Thomas speaking anymore, it was Cannon himself, an 8-year-old boy being honest about his experience in that very moment. The simplicity of his words cut through the theatrical pretense and touched something real in everyone watching. Stephen felt his throat tighten with emotion. His son hadn't recovered his forgotten lines. He'd found something better. He'd found his own voice. "But that's okay," Cannon continued, glancing at his scene partner Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "Because sometimes the things you don't plan to say are more important than the things you practiced." Emboldened by his son's courage, Stephen took another step closer to the stage. "What would Thomas want to say to his sister?" he called out gently, helping Cannon bridge back to his character, while honoring the authentic moment they were sharing. Cannon's face lit up with understanding. He turned to Sarah, no longer the frozen, panicked child from moments before, but a boy who had worked through his fear and found his footing again. "I would tell her," Cannon said, his voice gaining confidence, "that even when you're scared, even when you forget what you're supposed to do, America is still the place where you can try again, where people help you when you mess up." The words weren't from the script, but they captured the spirit of the play more powerfully than any rehearsed dialogue could have. Around the gymnasium, parents were wiping their eyes, moved not just by the performance but by the genuine moment of growth they were witnessing. Stephen felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with athletic achievement or public recognition. This was deeper, more fundamental, the pride of seeing his child discover his own resilience, his own ability to adapt and overcome. "And I would tell her," Cannon continued, looking directly at his father now, "that the scariest moments sometimes turn into the best ones, because that's when you find out what you're really made of." The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the polite, scripted applause typically reserved for children's performances. This was genuine, heartfelt appreciation for a moment of authentic human connection. Parents were standing, clapping not just for Cannon, but for the entire experience they'd just witnessed. Stephen couldn't contain himself any longer. He walked closer to the stage, his own eyes bright with tears he didn't try to hide. "I'm proud of you, son," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium. "Not because you're perfect, but because you kept going." Cannon beamed, his earlier embarrassment completely transformed into joy. The other children on stage began to clap as well, caught up in the celebration of their classmates' triumph over adversity. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the wings, abandoning her director's post to join the spontaneous celebration. She'd been teaching fourth grade for 15 years, had directed dozens of school plays, but she'd never experienced anything quite like this. What had started as a forgotten line had evolved into something more valuable than perfect execution. A lesson in resilience, authenticity, and the power of family support. "Should we continue with the play?" Sarah asked, still in character but clearly moved by what had just happened. Cannon looked around at his classmates, at the audience still applauding, at his father standing proudly in the aisle. "Yes," he said, "but can we make it up as we go? I think that might be more fun." The suggestion sparked laughter throughout the gymnasium. This wasn't how school plays typically went, but everyone in that room sensed they were witnessing something special. Something that would be talked about and remembered long after traditional performances were forgotten. Stephen returned to his seat, but the energy in the room had completely shifted. What had begun as a standard elementary school production had transformed into something more dynamic, more alive. The children on stage seemed liberated by Cannon's example, their performances becoming more natural, more spontaneous. As the play continued with a mixture of scripted dialogue and improvised moments, phones began appearing throughout the audience. Parents who had initially pulled out their devices to escape the awkward silence were now recording something entirely different. A celebration of childhood resilience, of family support, of the beautiful unpredictability of live performance. Aisha leaned over to Stephen, her voice filled with wonder. "Did you know he was going to say all that?" Stephen shook his head, still amazed by his son's recovery. "He surprised me completely. But that's what kids do, isn't it? They find ways to be braver than we ever imagined." The remainder of the performance unfolded with an energy and authenticity that scripted theater rarely achieves. The children, inspired by Cannon's example, brought new life to their characters, while the audience remained unusually engaged, knowing they were witnessing something unique. As the final scene approached, Cannon prepared for Thomas's closing monologue, the same speech that had caused his earlier panic. But now, standing confidently center stage, he seemed like a completely different child than the one who had frozen just 30 minutes earlier. "The American dream," he began, looking directly at his family, "isn't about being perfect. It's about having the courage to keep trying, even when things don't go according to plan." The final curtain fell to thunderous applause, but the real show was just beginning. As families gathered in the gymnasium lobby for the traditional post-performance reception, the energy was unlike anything the school had experienced. Parents clustered around Stephen and Aisha, not seeking autographs or selfies, but wanting to share their own stories of parenting, moments of times when their children had surprised them with unexpected resilience. "That was incredible," said Jennifer Martinez, whose daughter played one of Thomas's fellow immigrants. "I've never seen anything like it." Cannon turned a mistake into something beautiful. Mrs. Patterson appeared at Stephen's elbow, her eyes still bright with excitement. "In 15 years of directing school plays, I've never experienced anything that powerful. Your son didn't just recover from his forgotten lines, he created something entirely new." But it was 10-year-old Marcus Thompson, clutching his mother's hand, who provided the most telling reaction. "Mom," he whispered, loud enough for Stephen to overhear, "if Cannon can mess up and still be awesome, maybe I can try out for the basketball team next year." That comment stopped Stephen in his tracks. This was why moments like this mattered. Not because of viral videos or social media attention, but because one child's courage had inspired another child to face his own fears. Meanwhile, several parents were already uploading videos to their social media accounts. What had started as documentation of their children's performance had captured something much more significant. The footage showed not just a celebrity father supporting his son, but a universal moment of parental love meeting childhood vulnerability. Sarah Chen, a tech marketing executive and fellow parent, had captured the entire sequence on her phone. "This is going to resonate with people," she told her husband as they walked to their car. "It's not about basketball or fame. It's about being human." She was right. By the time the Curry family arrived home that evening, Sarah's video had already gained several hundred views on her Instagram account. But it was when ESPN's social media team picked up the story the next morning that everything changed. Watch. Stephen Curry's heartwarming response. "When his son forgets lines during school play," read the headline, that appeared across multiple sports media platforms. The video spread with remarkable speed across social media channels. But what made it go viral wasn't just Stephen's celebrity status. It was the authentic emotion captured in those few minutes. Viewers responded to Cannon's vulnerability, to Stephen's gentle encouragement, to the genuine moment of family connection that transcended the typical celebrity narrative. Comments poured in from around the world. "This is what real parenting looks like. Made me cry. What a beautiful moment." Cannon showed more courage in those few minutes than most adults show in a lifetime. This is why Stephen Curry is a champion in life, not just basketball. Major news outlets picked up the story. The Today Show reached out for an interview. Good Morning America wanted to have the family on as guests. But Stephen and Aisha made a decision that surprised many in the media world. They declined the interview requests. "This wasn't about us," Stephen explained to his publicist over the phone. "This was Cannon's moment, and I don't want to turn it into a media circus. He's 8 years old. He deserves to process this experience without cameras in his face." Instead, Stephen posted a simple message on his own social media accounts. "Proud dad moment. Sometimes the best performances come when we stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be real. Cannon taught me something about courage last night. Kids are incredible teachers if we're willing to listen." The post received over 2 million likes within 24 hours. But more importantly, it sparked conversations about parenting, about supporting children through failure, about the difference between perfection and authenticity. At Sacred Heart Preparatory, Cannon found himself experiencing a different kind of fame. Classmates who had witnessed his stage recovery began approaching him with their own stories of times they'd felt scared or overwhelmed. Teachers noticed that students seemed more willing to take risks in class, to raise their hands even when they weren't certain of the answers. The Cannon effect, Mrs. Patterson started calling it, the way one child's authentic moment had created ripple effects throughout the school community. A week after the performance, Cannon was walking to his classroom when he overheard 2 kindergartners talking in the hallway. "I'm scared about show and tell today," one little girl was saying to her friend. "It's okay," the other replied. "Remember what that big kid did in the play? He forgot his words, but then he said new ones, and everyone loved it. Maybe if you forget what to say, you can just say something else." Cannon smiled to himself, understanding for the first time that his moment of vulnerability had become something larger than his individual experience. He'd helped other kids feel less afraid of making mistakes. That evening at dinner, Riley looked across the table at her younger brother with new respect. "You know, what's cool about your play thing," she said. "It's not that you messed up and Dad helped you. It's that you figured out how to help yourself." Cannon considered this, twirling spaghetti around his fork thoughtfully. "I was really scared," he admitted. "But then I remembered that Dad always says mistakes are just practice for getting better." Stephen felt a warmth spread through his chest. His son had internalized the lesson in a way that went deeper than any viral video or media attention. Cannon hadn't just recovered from a forgotten line. He'd discovered something fundamental about resilience, about the courage to continue when things don't go according to plan. "You know what I learned that night?" Stephen said, looking around the table at his family. "I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just show up for the people you love. Not try to fix everything, not take over. Just be there and believe in them." Aisha reached over and squeezed his hand. "And sometimes," she added, "the most powerful thing you can do is keep going when you want to give up." Cannon, you showed everyone in that room what real courage looks like. As the family finished dinner and moved into their evening routines, The viral video continued to spread across the internet. But for the Currys, the real victory wasn't measured in views or shares. It was in the quiet confidence they saw in Cannon's eyes, the way he approached challenges with a little less fear and a little more trust in his ability to handle whatever came his way. The school play had ended, but the lessons it taught about vulnerability, support, resilience, and the power of authentic moments would continue reverberating through their family and community for years to come. Sometimes the most important victories happen not on basketball courts or in championship games, but in elementary school gymnasiums, when a father's love meets a son's courage and creates something beautiful enough to inspire the world.